The afternoon of January 29th, 1999, in Manassas, Virginia, held a deceptive normality. For 16-year-old Stacy Reed, it was a day of small triumphs. She had finished her school exams early and was heading back to the comfort of her family's home on McLean Street. The house she shared with her mother and her 14-year-old sister, Christy, was supposed to be a sanctuary. But waiting for her there was 20-year-old Paul Warner Powell, a young man she had known for 2.5 years. Their friendship, however, was strained by Powell's persistent romantic advances, which Stacy consistently rejected because she was in a committed relationship with Sean Wilkerson. This rejection was compounded by a toxic element of Powell's ideology. He was a self-proclaimed white supremacist, and the fact that Sean was black made Stacy's refusal an even deeper personal insult in his eyes. His presence that day was not a casual visit. He had already come to the house once, but left when Stacy's mother's fiancé, Robert Culver, arrived for his lunch break. Powell's return at 12:45 p.m. was deliberate and calculated. He was now armed for violence, carrying a blue bag that contained a 9mm handgun, a survival knife with a 5.5-inch blade, a butterfly knife, and a box cutter. Stacy, utterly unsuspecting of the danger posed by someone she considered a friend, was just finishing a phone call with her boyfriend when Powell knocked. She opened the door, an act of routine trust that allowed a predator with a heart full of hate and a bag full of weapons to step inside, setting into motion a chain of events that would forever shatter the Reed family's world. Inside the familiar surroundings of her home, the situation with Paul Powell escalated with terrifying speed. He immediately confronted Stacy, his demands that she break up with Sean Wilkerson turning from verbal insistence into physical aggression. What began as a heated argument soon devolved into a violent struggle. Powell would later provide a self-serving account to the police, claiming that Stacy had attacked him first, scratching his face, and that during the ensuing scuffle, she was accidentally stuck with his survival knife. However, the meticulous forensic evidence and the later autopsy findings would completely dismantle this fabricated story, revealing a far more brutal and deliberate attack. After stabbing Stacy, Powell displayed a chilling and profound indifference. He did not call for emergency services or check to see if the young woman was still alive. Instead, he behaved as if he had all the time in the world, wandering through the home of the family he was devastating. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of iced tea, lit a cigarette, and waited. This period of calm in the immediate aftermath of such extreme violence highlighted a remorseless and calculated state of mind. He was still lounging in the house when the next act of his planned atrocity arrived. A little after 3 p.m., the front door opened and 14-year-old Christy Reed returned home from school. She was immediately met by Powell, who stood as an unwelcome and ominous figure in her own home. He calmly told her that her sister was in her bedroom, a deliberate and cruel lie designed to get Christy inside and under his control, setting the innocent teenager on a direct collision course with the horror that had already engulfed her sister and the even greater personal terror that awaited her in the basement. For 14-year-old Christy Reed, the reality of the situation crashed down upon her the moment she stepped further into her own home. She immediately discovered her sister Stacy's lifeless body, a sight of unimaginable horror that caused her to drop her school books in shock and despair. In this moment of overwhelming grief and pure terror, Paul Powell seized absolute control. He ordered the sobbing and terrified teenager to go down to the basement. Christy, acutely aware that Powell was known to carry weapons and fearing immediate violence, felt she had no choice but to obey his command. The descent into the basement was a journey into a personal hell, moving away from the safety of the outside world and into a confined space with her sister's killer. Once there, Powell's commands became violently invasive. He forced the 14-year-old to remove her clothes and then raped her as she pleaded and begged him not to kill her. Powell would later coldly admit to investigators that he knew Christy was a virgin at the time of the assault, a detail that underscored the calculated and predatory nature of his brutality. This horrific act was suddenly interrupted by a loud and persistent knock at the front door. It was Christy's friend, Mark Lewis, whose untimely arrival created a critical and life-saving distraction. Panicked but focused, Powell quickly used Christy's own shoelaces to bind her hands tightly behind her back and tie her legs together. After ensuring she was restrained and helpless, he got dressed and went upstairs to deal with the visitor, leaving Christy alone in the basement, injured, violated, and terrified, but with a fleeting and precious opportunity to fight for her life. Alone in the cold and frightening darkness of the basement, Christy Reed, though bound, traumatized, and in pain, summoned an incredible will to survive. She fought against the restraints, and the shoelaces Powell had hastily used were not secure enough to hold her determined efforts. With immense physical and mental effort, she managed to work her hands free from their bindings. Knowing that Powell would return from upstairs at any moment, her immediate priority was to find a place to hide from his certain return. She scooted and dragged herself across the hard basement floor, her movements severely limited by her injuries and the sheer physical and emotional trauma of the assault she had just endured. Her goal was the small, dark, and cramped space under the wooden basement stairs, a spot that offered a desperate sliver of hope for concealment. However, as she heard the unmistakable and terrifying sound of Paul Powell descending the steps back into the basement, she was faced with an impossible, split-second decision. Her logic was both heartbreaking and strategic. If he found her missing from the spot where he had left her, his rage would be immediate and fatal. In a courageous and desperate gamble to de-escalate his anger, Christy made the conscious choice to return to the exact location where he had tied her up. She presented herself as compliant and defeated, hoping he would believe she had never moved. This tragic decision, meant to appease her attacker, instead placed her directly back in the path of his escalating violence as Powell, upon seeing her, moved to eliminate the only living witness to his crimes. Convinced that Christy was the sole witness who could connect him to the murder of Stacy and the subsequent assault, Paul Powell decided she had to die. He moved toward her and used his bare hands to strangle her, applying relentless pressure until she lost consciousness and lay motionless on the cold basement floor. Believing his task was complete, Powell then took one of his knives and, to ensure her death, stabbed her once in the abdomen. He also dragged the blade across her throat, slicing it open. Convinced he had successfully killed her, Powell's actions then shifted from homicidal violence to callous, mundane opportunism. He calmly went back upstairs, leaving Christy for dead in a pool of her own blood. He returned to the kitchen, poured himself another glass of iced tea, and lit a cigarette, as if he were a guest relaxing after a long day. He then proceeded to wander methodically through the Reed family home, opening drawers and cabinets, searching for money, jewelry, or anything else of value he could steal. Finding nothing he deemed worth taking, he simply walked out of the house and left the neighborhood. His destination was a friend's house in the District of Columbia, where he planned to use whatever money he had to buy crack cocaine, showing no urgency, no visible remorse, and a detached focus solely on his next desired high. Meanwhile, back in the silent basement of the home on McLean Street, a miraculous act of survival was beginning to unfold. Against all odds and medical expectations, Christy Reed regained consciousness. She was still bound, naked, and bleeding profusely from the deep, catastrophic wounds to her neck and stomach, but the spark of life within her had not been extinguished. At approximately 4:10 p.m., a key turned in the lock of the Reed home, breaking the heavy silence. Robert Culver, Stacy's mother's fiancé, magically returned home. In the profound quiet of the basement, Christy, summoning every last ounce of her fading strength, began to call out his name. Her voice was weak and strained, the damage to her throat making it difficult to project, and Culver, upstairs, could not make out the distinct words clearly. But an instinctual feeling that something was terribly wrong took hold of him. The house was unusually and eerily quiet, and he could not locate either of the girls. His search began, and it quickly turned into a sequential discovery of horror. He first noticed the disarray in Stacy's room, a sign of a struggle. Then, he entered Christy's bedroom and found Stacy's body on the floor. He saw the blood and knew immediately she was not breathing. His heart sinking with dread, his thoughts turned to the urgent need to find a telephone to call for help. He rushed down to the basement, and it was there he made the second, gut-wrenching discovery. Christy was on the floor, just as Powell had left her, naked, bound with her own shoelaces, and bleeding heavily from the savage wounds to her neck and abdomen. Acting swiftly, Culver ignored his own shock and panic. He immediately called 911, his voice tight with urgency as he relayed the dire emergency to the dispatcher. While waiting for the paramedics to arrive, he began administering whatever first aid he could to Christy, applying pressure to her wounds in a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding and keep her alive. The paramedics arrived shortly after, and, as they worked to stabilize her for a frantic airlift to Inova Fairfax Hospital, one of them leaned close and asked the critically injured girl who had done this to her. With immense effort, Christie mouthed the two words that would set the entire investigation in motion. Paul Powell. The investigation moved with swift and decisive force following Christie's crucial identification of her attacker. On January 30th, 1999, just one day after the horrific crimes, police located and arrested Paul Warner Powell at his girlfriend's residence. The physical evidence against him was immediately substantial and damning. In his possession, officers found the specific blue bag he had carried with him to the Reed home. Inside was a cache of weapons that directly linked him to the scene. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol with a full magazine of Winchester cartridges, a survival knife with a 5.5-inch blade in a black sheath, and a butterfly knife with a 5-inch blade. The survival knife bore a critical piece of evidence, a dark, reddish stain on its blade. Forensic analysis would soon confirm this was Stacy Reed's blood. Furthermore, the DNA evidence collected from Christie Reed during her medical examination provided a perfect match to Paul Powell, irrevocably placing him at the scene of the rape and attempted murder. The medical evidence was equally devastating. Christie's survival was deemed miraculous, as each of her wounds was a mere centimeter from puncturing a major artery. Stacy's autopsy revealed the brutal truth, showing her death resulted from stab wounds to her heart, with the knife being withdrawn and reinserted, and her body was covered in defensive wounds and bruises that completely contradicted Powell's story of an accidental stabbing. The case was an airtight prosecution, but Powell's own words, written from behind bars, would soon provide an even more damning and shocking account of his motives and actions, revealing a depth of hatred and arrogance that the physical evidence alone could not fully capture. From his jail cell, Paul Powell began to write a series of letters that would ultimately seal his fate. He corresponded with friends, other inmates, and even the jury forewoman from his first trial, and in these writings he dropped all pretense of innocence. He openly admitted to murdering Stacy Reed and to the rape and attempted murder of Christie. His motives, laid bare on paper, were even more disturbing than initially suspected. He expressed a desire to kill everybody in this fucked up country that is not white, directly linking his actions to his virulent white supremacist beliefs. In a particularly cruel act, he wrote to a female friend and asked her to find someone to threaten Christie, instructing them to call the young girl and tell her she must recant her statement to police and refuse to testify, or she would be killed. To another inmate, he confessed the murder was fueled by rage after Stacy refused his sexual advances following her phone call with Wilkerson. He chillingly described Stacy's murder as a human sacrifice and expressed a twisted sense of satisfaction at having raped a virgin. He also provided a more gruesome account of his attack on Christie, admitting that when his knife proved too dull to effectively cut her throat, he resorted to stomping on her neck. These letters, filled with bragging, hatred, and obscenity, revealed a complete lack of remorse and provided prosecutors with a devastating portrait of the man they were dealing with, one whose own arrogance would soon provide the key to delivering the justice he had momentarily escaped. The legal journey that followed was as turbulent and protracted as the crime was brutal. Paul Powell was initially convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in May of 2000, but in a stunning turn, the Virginia Supreme Court overturned that conviction on a technicality in April 2001, resentencing him to life in prison. Believing himself untouchable due to double jeopardy, Powell then penned a grotesquely detailed and taunting letter to prosecutor Paul Ebert in October 2001, bragging about his premeditated attempt to rape Stacy and his subsequent stomping on her throat after stabbing her. This act of sheer arrogance proved to be his undoing, as the letter provided new evidence of a separate criminal act, the attempted rape of Stacy, for which he had not been tried, allowing for a second capital murder indictment in January 2003, where he was once again sentenced to death. On March 18, 2010, at the Greensville Correctional Center, 31-year-old Paul Warner Powell was executed in the electric chair, the second-to-last person to die in it before Virginia abolished the death penalty. When asked for his final words, the man who had written so many pages of vile boasts was utterly silent. The Reed family witnessed his execution, with Christie, then 25, stating it was a necessary end to their torment, and that he definitely deserves to die. Stacy's memory lives on through the SDACIE Foundation, which means Strive to Achieve Compassion, Intervention, and Education, established by her mother, Lorraine, to support other victims of violent crime. Christie Reed carries the physical and emotional scars from that day, but she has reframed them as a testament to her survival, a permanent reminder of her immense strength and her sister's stolen future, finally bringing a painful, decades-long chapter to a close. If you found this story interesting, do well to leave a like. I thank you for your time. Until next time, take care.